Alrighty, it's 4 o'clock on my clock. So hello everyone, welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space, and thank you for joining us for How Should We Think Today on the importance of philosophy in times of ecological crisis. I'll pass it over to organizers and our special guest in just a moment, but first, to help situate you, whether you're joining us in person or via Zoom, we are streaming to YouTube Live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Jagay, Montreal. As caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, if you're new to us, we'll just quickly introduce what we do here. We work with the university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that invite Concordians together with external partners and audience members such as yourselves to examine the research questions and projects in development here at the university and with our partners beyond. A quick note about engagement here today. If you're joining us online and you'd like to jump into the conversation during Q&A or afterwards, please feel free to turn on your camera, raise a hand, and we'll call upon you. Otherwise, the chat is of course activated if you'd like to pop your reflections in there, and we'll attend to them. We'll read them out for everyone here in the space. And if you're in the space and you have a question or a comment after the talk, please do raise a hand as well so we can get a microphone to you so that the folks on Zoom can hear what you have to say. Thanks very much, everyone. We're so pleased to welcome you all. Thank you to the students of Philosophy Association for making this possible. And I'll now pass it over to Celine. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this talk. My name is Soline Van de Mortel, and with my peer, Ashkan Hagigat. We are both final year honors philosophy students at Concordia University, and we are part of SOPHIA, the Students of Philosophy Association here in this school, and it's through this structure that we organize this event. Before proceeding with an introduction to the event, we would like to begin by thanking both ASPHA, the Arts and Science Federation of Associations, as well as the faculty of the Department of Philosophy here at Concordia for their sponsorship and support for this event. We would also like to thank Fourth Space not only for providing this wonderful space, but also for helping us literally every step of the way in organizing this. It's kind of the first time Ash and I have organized something like this, so it was really wonderful to have their help and support. So we began organizing this event in the past summer. It came out of this desire to motivate students to consider the practicality and importance of philosophy, especially in times of ecological crisis. The ecological crisis being a phenomenon whose presence is like increasing in the media and our immediate lives. And it's really important to have spaces to talk about these things through critical thinking. And it also came out of desire to motivate a deeper sense of community within the philosophy student body and beyond, as we have seen that the pandemic's lasting effects have made it harder for students to connect with one another and attend extracurricular activities in this kind of field. We are beyond excited to have our guest, Dr. Andrew Biro, here for today's lecture. I actually first discovered his work last year while doing research for a paper on ecology and materialism, so it's so exciting to have him here today. His work could not be more important and pertinent to the subject of our event, so it's a great honor to receive him at Fourth Space. So Dr. Andrew Biro is a professor in political science at Acadia University. His books include Critical Ecologies, the Frankfurt School, and Contemporary Environmental Crises, published in 2011, as well as Denaturalizing Ecological Politics, Alienation and Nature from Rousseau to the Frankfurt School and Beyond, published in 2005. His works focus on topics of environmental politics and water, critical theory, political economy, and media and politics. He's affiliated with and teaches in Acadia's interdisciplinary MA program in social and political thought. We will begin the event with Dr. Biro's lecture, which will then be followed by a short Q&A and a break for snacks and drinks. We will continue then with a roundtable discussion, which will feature selected prompts and breakout sessions, maybe, to motivate discussion. On that last point, I will note that this is a kind of topic that, the roundtable discussion isn't very structured. I think the point is really to bring up the fact that this is a really new phenomenon that we're dealing with, and that I think already having a space to just kind of talk about it and really putting forward to personal experience as something that we want to say that's important, and making it, recognize that you don't have to just be an expert in the issue, and that you can be young and have things to say about something so important. So thank you all for joining us, and we will give the stage now to Dr. Biro. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again, Celine, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to come here and give this talk. Thanks to the Fourth Space staff, especially Anna, for just making sure that I was unmuted just now, for helping to get this set up. And thanks to everyone for coming here, both in person and online, and particularly in person, given the, I guess, typical Montreal January weather. The title of my talk is How Should We Think Today on the Importance of Philosophy in Times of Ecological Crisis? And I'll start by letting you know what the thesis for the talk is, and maybe a couple of disclaimers, so you know what I am going to talk about and what I'm not going to talk about. So first, for the thesis is that yes, philosophy is important, essential even, in today's moment of ecological crisis. So to all the philosophy students out there, congratulations on doing a really useful degree, something that probably philosophy students don't hear enough. Not something, well, I won't give examples of useless degrees because this is being live streamed. So philosophy is a very useful degree. Congratulations on doing it. What am I not going to say, or what are some disclaimers? The first one, and I discussed this with Celine and Ash when I first got the invitation, is about my status as a philosopher. So the last time I was in a philosophy class was in my first year of undergraduate studies in 1987-88. I haven't taken a philosophy class since then. I haven't taught any philosophy classes. I do teach political theory or political philosophy, but that's in a politics department and an interdisciplinary MA program. So I do work that I guess I would consider to be kind of philosophy adjacent, but some of my philosopher colleagues might say that I'm not a real philosopher. So with that said, also, I do think that philosophy and thinking is important, and that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. But I do want to say that this does not mean that action is unimportant, or I don't want people to think about it in terms of a sort of dichotomy between thinking on the one hand and action on the other. And I'll come back to that, I think, towards the end. But philosophy is useful, it's practical, it's not separated from action. And the final disclaimer, which is not something that's on the slide, is just about the discussion prompts, which Celine mentioned. So I got those today. They weren't prepared in light of my talk, and my talk wasn't prepared in light of the discussion prompts. I think they're good questions, and they'll generate some good discussion. I think my talk in some ways touches on things that are relevant to those questions, but in some ways goes in kind of different directions, and that's obviously fine. Okay, so like I said, I'm not a philosopher, and I have some maybe some insecurities about that. So I'll start with dropping some philosophy names and some sort of guiding questions that I've got for this talk, which I derive from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, says that the interests of reason can be found in these three questions: what can I know? What ought I to do? And what may I hope? And as Celine mentioned, I teach in the MA program in Social and Political Thought at Acadia. I teach a course there called Environmental Political Theory, and in that class, in the syllabus, I tell students, so on the first day of class, they know that these are the final exam questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? And what may I hope? So they're kind of discussion prompts, but they're pretty big and general ones. So they're sort of guiding thread through this talk, not ones that I'm obviously going to come up with any definitive answers to by the end of it. But maybe some things to think about. And I'll also just give one more thank you to my former student, Max Abulaban, who I was talking to a few weeks ago about this talk, and sort of thinking about, like, you know, I've been asked to talk about the importance of philosophy to an audience of mostly undergraduate students. You know, any thoughts about how to frame it or what might work? And he suggested, hey, remember in that environmental political theory class, Kant's 3 questions, maybe that would be a good framework for the talk. So thanks to Max for that. Okay, so with all that as a kind of prelude, and I'm realizing now I can't see the clock with this screen share, so I'm just going to try to keep myself to time. I have one question that I'm going to ask the audience before the Q&A kind of section, and it's related to this slide, just to get a sense of where people are sort of at and sort of the currency of this term. How many people know of, or does someone know what the Anthropocene is? Some hands are up. Does anyone want to, like, this will get hands down, anyone want to tell everyone what the Anthropocene is? Yeah. Yeah, great. The geological era in which humans have affected the environment, right? So it's a term that Earth scientists have come up with to describe our current geological era. There's some debate about when exactly it starts, but they're saying that the current environment is one, or the current era is one, where humans have become a geological force on the planet. Or one way to think about it is, you know, millions of years from now, when aliens come to our planet and want to discover what was happening at this time, they'll be able to look at the geological record the same way that we look at the geological record and find dinosaur fossils. They'll be able to see how humans lived on this planet. So, like I said, this is a concept that comes from Earth science, or Earth system science. It's one that has become increasingly important in environmental thinking. It's not one that's in the title of my talk. Obviously, the title talks or mentions ecological crisis. So maybe this is the time to say that the ecological crisis that we're talking about in the title, the term crisis in its original meaning means turning point. So we can think about the Anthropocene as a kind of turning point, a crisis point, whether we're thinking about extreme weather events leading to floods or wildfires, whether we're thinking about resource extraction, whether we're thinking about waste disposal, whether we're thinking about habitat and biodiversity loss. We're at a kind of turning point or inflection point in terms of the history of our global environment. So that's the concept of the Anthropocene. The concept raises some questions, some of which I'm going to deal with more explicitly than others in this talk. The first one, which I'm not going to say too much about, but just to refer back to that Las Vegas or repurposed Las Vegas sign, welcome to the fabulous Anthropocene. Is it really fabulous? The images in the previous slide suggest maybe not. Also, the Anthropocene, or the concept, one of the questions that's been raised about it is whether that's the best term for the current era. Is the anthropos, is humanity really what's responsible for getting us to this current crisis or turning point? And so a number of different names have been suggested, alternative names to Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, Urbanthropocene, Manthropocene. There's probably at least half a dozen others, all of which are there to suggest that it's not humanity in general that is responsible. It's not all 8 billion of us equally responsible for this change, but either some subset of humanity that's making most of the decisions, or some kind of social system that we're in, rather than us as an entire species. But whether we think it's humanity in general, or capitalism, or plantation agriculture, or urbanization, or patriarchy, or whatever else, all of these are systems that are that derive from human beings, that are created by human beings, or the anthropos. So one of the questions that I want to talk a little bit more about is who or what is this anthropos? What does it mean to be human? What is the nature of human being? And the other question about the Anthropocene is, how should we respond to it? Right? We find ourselves in this moment of inflection, this turning point, this moment of crisis. How do we respond? What should we do? So I'll suggest to start that there are 3 dominant responses, and if you've been to talks like this, you might already know what's coming. I'll give you 3 possible answers, and I'm going to say all of them are wrong, or at least if they're not completely wrong, they're only partially correct, or there are problems with some of them, or limitations to each of them. So 3 dominant responses, and we can probably think of lots of examples to each of them. The first is what's been called doomerism, right? This is the idea that we're now at the point where some kind of catastrophic collapse is inevitable. There's nothing we can do. As the name kind of suggests. Maybe the most prominent example of this is a guy named Roy Scranton, who has a book based on a New York Times article that he wrote a few years ago called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. So that gives you a sense of that kind of response. We're doomed, not much we can do about it. The second is, in a way, kind of the mirror image of that response, and that's a kind of techno-optimism. I promised myself I would not say the name of the guy who owns Twitter. So another example of this kind of response is a guy named Noah Smith who writes for Bloomberg. He's an opinions columnist for Bloomberg. He's an example of this kind of techno-optimism, which is basically the idea that, yes, we have a lot of very serious environmental problems, but human beings have always faced really serious problems, and we're an innovative, entrepreneurial, ingenious kind of species. We always manage to find our way to sort of find technological, or in some cases, other kinds of fixes to work our way out of it. So yeah, things look really bad, but don't worry, somebody's going to invent something that's going to be, a carbon-free energy source that is easily scalable and doesn't have many ecological impacts, or we'll be able to colonize other planets, or we'll upload ourselves to a cloud, and everything will be fine. Don't worry. So there's those 2. And then the third one is, I'm not sure actually if actionism is a word, but I'm going to use it anyway. And that's the idea that we're not totally doomed, and we're not guaranteed to have some kind of technological fix. We do need to act to respond to this crisis, and we're facing a ticking clock in order to be able to respond to this, or we need to take that ticking clock into account. This, I think, is a pretty common trope or way of thinking about it. By 2030, we need to reduce emissions to X level, or we need to be carbon neutral by a certain point, or whatever it is. There's a couple of problems with this, I think. One, we can see, so here's an example of this kind of actionism. It's taken from an article from The Guardian about now King, but at the time Prince Charles, who was, and students might not be old enough to remember this actually, he was at the time the public figure who was most prominently associated with what was called the 100 Months campaign. This is a campaign that suggested that human beings, or we collectively, have 100 months to act. That's a quote from the article. Only 100 months to act before the damage caused by global warming becomes irreversible. And if you can see the fine print at the top, the yellow banner at the top of that article, it tells readers that this article is more than 13 years old. You can maybe do the math in your head, but if not, this article from March 2009 is from 166 months ago. So when we talk about this kind of discourse, or this kind of framing of the ticking clock, one problem is what happens after we pass the deadline. Right? This is a familiar maybe problem for students or professors. Deadline is set, and then we get past that deadline, and we haven't done what we're supposed to do. So does that mean we revert to the doomerist kind of response, or do we set ourselves another deadline, in which case, we can ask, like, why are these really deadlines, or are these deadlines really real? So that's one kind of problem with that scenario. Another problem with it, or that kind of framing, another problem with it, maybe more substantive, is about this idea or the metaphor of the ticking clock. We can think about the clock as maybe the paradigmatic technology of modernity. So there are lots of different kinds of societies and cultures in the history of human evolution. Lots of them didn't have technologies that allowed them to measure time in this kind of homogeneous, discretely measured kind of way, right? A second is a second is a second is a second. A minute is a minute, it's a minute, an hour is an hour is an hour, and so on. But it's hard to think of how our current modern society could function without the technology of the clock, right? We wouldn't know how to all gather here at 4 o'clock in person or online, to know that we have to leave this space at 6 o'clock because there's something else going on. And all kinds of aspects of our lives are governed by this kind of technology of the clock and what it implies for our way of thinking about time. So one of the questions is whether we should be using the concepts and the tools that have brought us to this inflection point. If we think that the culture of modernity is part of what is driving this crisis of unsustainability, then should we really be relying on this kind of technology to get us out of that problem? What all three of these responses, I think, have in common, or a couple of things that I think all three of these responses have in common, is first of all, they all start with a natural scientific representation of the world or environment as their ontological foundation. So there's some big philosophy words. Basically, the idea here is that science is the starting point. Science tells us what people can or can't, in the case of doomers, or should or must do. And a classic example of this, I think, is the carbon budget, right? Science tells us what our carbon budget is, and that's the starting point for action or for any kind of decisions. And the second thing that, again, all three of them share is that, again, if we start with this natural scientific representation as the ontological foundation, then the social sciences and the humanities, including philosophy, but also politics, discipline, or sociology, or economics, or maybe even psychology, are kind of reduced to the role of junior partner in these interdisciplinary exercises. And the role of the social sciences and humanities is to take that natural scientific foundation, and then from there, from that menu that science gives us, then we can make those choices. Or the role of social sciences and humanities is to convince people to listen to the science, right? And we can think about environmental crisis or the pandemic as another kind of example of this, where the role of social sciences and humanities is seen as getting people to listen to the science. And I think a great sort of pop culture example of this is the film Don't Look Up, where poor Leo DiCaprio, the scientist who understands what's going on, is faced with these political and media systems that he is unable to break through and to get the truth out to the people. Okay, so if those are the dominant responses, is there an alternative? I think so. And the path to the alternative, or a starting point for the alternative, is to start not with the question of what does science tell us is available, something like a carbon budget, but rather what do we need, right? And if we think about how households or families actually operate, how household budgets actually operate, it's maybe a little bit closer to the question of what do we need, as opposed to strictly what do we have available, what's in the bank account, right? Sure, what's in the bank account, what's in the budget informs our discussion, but it isn't necessarily the starting and ending point, right? Similarly, rather than starting with the question of how can we solve environmental problems, maybe we start with the question of how should we live in this current damaged world, and that's just the word damage is just a kind of footnote or citation of Theodore Adorno's, another like philosophy name drop there. So rather than thinking about this as a problem to be solved, maybe we think about this as a condition that we now have to inhabit. Not accepting everything as completely unchangeable, but not in a sort of problem-solving mindset. So these questions, what do we need? How should we live? Both of these questions have that problematic word we. And so I think we need to spend a bit of time unpacking or thinking about who or what is the we in those sentences or those questions. What do we need? How should we live? Or who or what is the anthropos in the Anthropocene? I'm going to start by offering two answers to that question, one very old answer and one much newer answer. And then I'll try to synthesize and draw some commonalities out between them before coming back to the question of how to respond to the Anthropocene in the final part of the talk. Okay, so here's the first old answer. It's the last, I think, last philosophy name drop of the talk. Aristotle in the Politics, in fact, in book 1, chapter 1, in the very first paragraph, Aristotle says, man is by nature a political animal, zoon politikon. This is a quote that political scientists like me like to quote a lot because it tells us that politics is essential to what it means to be human. And so by this, I think Aristotle means a couple of things when he's talking about what it means to be human. It's, as with a lot of things in Aristotle, when he's talking about nature, it's both a descriptive claim about what the world is like and a normative claim about how things ought to be. So in the first case, Aristotle looks around at all the other animals and says, hey, human beings are the only animals that live in a polis, in a city-state, in a political community. Right? There are other social animals, but it's only human beings who live in groups that are guided by laws and where we deliberate over how to organize our lives, right? Politics. So it's only human beings that live like that compared to all other animals. And the normative part is, Aristotle says, that engaging in politics is essential to living a fully human life, right? So it's not just a descriptive claim about how human beings happen to live, but he's also saying, if you really want to live a full human life, if you want to be a good human being, part of that is engaging in this kind of deliberative process, thinking about and making decisions over how we should live our collective lives. So that's the old answer to what it means to be human. For the newer answer, I'm going to draw on not a philosopher, but a contemporary comparative cognitive primatologist by the name of Tetsuro Matsuzawa. There's a couple of pictures on this slide. They're both pictures of slides from a talk that he gave that's on YouTube. So I don't know if this is recorded, then you can just, you'll be able to see the link there. If not, and you want to see it, and I encourage people to watch the video. It's really fascinating. And if you just Google Matsuzawa comparative cognition in primates or cognitive trade-off hypothesis, you'll find it pretty easily. So this first slide shows what Matsuzawa calls the cognitive trade-off hypothesis. So Matsuzawa, like I said, is a comparative primatologist. He's interested in the similarities and differences between different primate species, and particularly in this case between human beings and chimpanzees. So humans and chimps have a common ancestor that lived about 5 million years ago. And since that time, they have evolved in different ways. We sometimes, I think, have a tendency to think that human beings are smarter than all other animals. And one of Matsuzawa's concerns or aims is to debunk that. And to say it's not that humans are smarter than chimpanzees, for example, but rather we have different kinds of cognitive strengths, right? We think in different kind of ways. And the way he characterizes it is as this cognitive trade-off. It's his hypothesis. There's some controversy, I think, about whether it's actually a trade-off, but where there's no controversy is that human beings and chimpanzees think differently. And one of the big differences is in their different strengths in terms of working memory or immediate memory and language. So chimpanzees have much more highly functional, much better working memory or immediate memory than human beings do. And there's some really interesting experiments in the video that demonstrate this really clearly. They're much smarter at, like, you flash something on a screen and being able to memorize it and reproduce it, much better at human beings than that. Matsuzawa's theory is that the part of our brain that deals with that, we lost that as we evolved the capacity for language. So that's where human beings have this strength, is in the capacity for language and abstract representation and communication. For chimpanzees, it's working memory and less capacity for language. So what this means, Matsuzawa's conclusion, is he says, when we think about what's uniquely human, what does this capacity for language and abstract representation at the expense of working memory, what does it get us? Well, it gets us the capacity for imagination. That's a uniquely human thing, he says. The capacity to abstract or extract something from its particular environment and represent it, repurpose it, recontextualize it. That's fundamentally the work of imagination that we can do. And part of what comes with that is our ability to understand others' minds, right? Again, something that he thinks is uniquely human, this capacity to sort of see into what other people are thinking, or to be able to at least imagine what other people are thinking and feeling. And from this, he gets a conclusion that sharing and giving is something that is, again, uniquely human. I'm maybe less convinced by the last point, the sharing and giving, but certainly this idea of understanding others and the capacity for imaginative representation is really, really important. So we have Aristotle on the one hand, we have Matsuzawa on the other. What can we take from this? And I'll throw a couple of other things in as well. So the first thing, I think this is uncontroversial about human beings, is that they're social animals, right? We live in groups. We are dependent on others for our survival, for our reproduction. And so we're social animals. We're certainly not the only social animals, but we are social animals. We're also capable of abstract or conceptual thinking, including language. This differentiates us, as I said, from at least other primate species. There's some evidence that there are other species that have language, maybe language forms that are possibly as complex as human beings. I would encourage people, if you're interested in these kinds of things, to look at the Dominica sperm whale project, which is run out of Dalhousie University in Halifax, where they're doing research on language and communication in sperm whales and cultural differences among sperm whale groups that arise out of different languages. So that's really interesting. Maybe we're not the only beings that think abstractly and use language, but we do that. And maybe what differentiates us from other language-using animals like sperm whales is that we're also tool-making and tool-using animals. And there are other tool-using animals out there as well. But humans are probably the most adept at creating and using tools, which gives us a lot of leverage in terms of our ability to reshape our environments, or as ecologists say, to engage in this project of niche construction, right? To the point where we've created niches or habitats for ourselves on virtually every kind of terrestrial environment or ecosystem on the planet. So human beings live in all kinds of different ecological conditions, including snowy Montreal in January, because of our capacity to make tools. And the last thing to say about, at least for now, about human beings is that we are highly flexible in how we satisfy our needs. right? So again, if you think about the diversity of human cultures over tens of thousands of years and across the globe, you'll quickly see that there are lots of different ways that human groups, cultures, societies organize themselves, lots of different ways that we find to meet our needs that we have, and ways that we have evolved to meet various kinds of needs. And that's why for Aristotle it's so important to think about and deliberate over how we should live our collective lives, because we have lots of choices, right? We can live in lots of different kinds of ways and meet our needs in various kinds of ways. Okay, let's come back just to remind you, guiding questions: what can I know, what ought I to do, and what may I hope? I'll say a little bit to sort of draw some things out about, in particular, what we can know, with some implications about what we ought to do and what we may hope, before getting to the conclusion. So first, again, when we talk about human beings or the anthropos, we are beings that are embedded in the social and ecological systems that we are constantly reshaping and reworking. Right? We're embedded in social systems, we're embedded in ecological systems, and we're engaged in the activity of changing those social and ecological systems over time, but we can never completely step outside of them. Right? We're always a part of these systems that we're trying to reshape or to work on. So there's no sort of Archimedean point outside of our social system that we can stand on to look at it objectively, or our ecological system that we can stand outside of it to look at it objectively, or at least not with complete objectivity. It's not to say that we can't know anything. Certainly we can know lots of things, but we can't have a completely objective outsider's view of the systems that we're a part of. Second, dependence on others is essential. We are social beings and we work collectively to satisfy our needs. But need satisfaction is still, for the most part, an individual phenomenon, right? So we work collectively as a species, as a society, as a group, as a culture to, for example, get enough food for everybody. But if I see other people eating food, that doesn't make me any less hungry. Right? So need satisfaction is individual, but we're dependent on others. So there's this inevitable kind of tension between the individual and the group. And third, language or any system of representation that we have, any system of abstract representation of reality, and again, this is the gift or the ability that human beings have, represents reality. It's a system of representation. It's not a mirror of reality, right? So there's inevitably in language or in art or in any other kind of system of representation that we can think of, this is, I think, an inevitable feature of it. There's some kind of distortion or something that's missing or something that's added in. The map is not the territory, in other words. Right, so all of these present us with kind of limitations on what we can know, and that has implications again for what we ought to do and what we can hope. We are highly adept, but not perfect, at reshaping our environment. Right? So it means, in terms of what we can hope for, at least from my perspective, we can't hope for utopia. Right? We're never going to get a perfectly engineered system that seamlessly meets everybody's needs without any problems. We can have better and worse systems for sure, but we can't perfectly construct, or we can't construct a perfect environment. Second, and along with that, we understand others' minds, to use Matsuzawa's term or phrase. We understand others' minds only imperfectly. Right? We think we can understand what other people are thinking or how other people are feeling, but it's always only imperfect. And our systems of communication, and this is in a sense saying just the same thing, we're imperfectly networked beings. Our systems of communication are really powerful. They allow us to cooperate in really important and powerful ways, but they're not perfect. And you can think back to any difficult conversation you've had with a friend or a family member or a romantic partner, let alone a boss or a sales representative or something like that. How difficult it is to communicate your needs to someone else, or to have someone else be able to communicate their needs to you. Sometimes it's really easy, right? Like, I'm thirsty, can I have a glass of water? Yes, thank you. But when you think about, again, the more intimate relationships that we have and the more complex needs that we have in managing those kinds of emotional relationships, how difficult it is to really understand what is it that this person is trying to tell me, right? What does this person really need? How can I help them? Or how can I get this person to understand what I really need without hurting their feelings, without offending them, or whatever? Okay, so in conclusion, on the importance of philosophy or thinking, I think the most important question in times of ecological crisis is still an old, or maybe the old philosophical question: how should I live? Or how should we live? To put the more sort of political spin on it, how should we live together? To answer this question in times of ecological crisis, we need thinking that is, and just because I like lists of three, as you may have noticed already, we need thinking that is or does three kinds of things, or three kinds of thinking. We need thinking that is critical or reflective, right? If we are at a crisis point, a turning point, an inflection point, we don't need to, and in fact, we shouldn't necessarily take what has brought us to this point as a given, right? We should critically reflect on all of the things, all of the baggage that has come with us to get us to this point, if we really are at a crisis or inflection point. So critical thinking, reflective thinking, I think is really important. Second, because we are social beings, and because, as Aristotle tells us, political life is so important, and the capacity to engage in these kinds of collective decision-making is so important. We need thinking that is deliberative, right? It is not just a matter of a single person, maybe philosopher, going off to their philosophy office and coming up with the answer, getting that sort of light bulb moment. Rather, we can only come to answer these kinds of questions through dialogue, through collective deliberation, through thinking about things together, because we need to understand each other's needs. And we're all individuals, we're all different, we all have different kinds of needs to be met. And the third and final thing, again, to come back to the point that I raised at the beginning, is that we need thinking that is capable of informing action or practice. So it's not just a matter of coming up with these ideas in the abstract, or blueprints that never get realized, but rather thinking that is that can inform and that engages with action and practice as we inhabit the environment that we have been given and think about how we want to reshape it for the future. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I'll stop sharing too.
We have any questions? So we're gonna do a short Q&A, 5 or 10 minutes or so. If anyone has any questions on the get-go for Dr. Byro.
Sorry, just 1 second.
Yeah, we got a mic coming up.
That way people online can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the talk. I had a question regarding your first, let's say, distinction between the work of like natural sciences and social sciences, or humanities on the other hand. And I feel like this, let's say, split of work that those two great fields do really isn't quite effective anymore. I mean, even in the own consciousness of scientists that think about their own practices, I don't feel like this split of what we ought to do as scientists or epistemic agents. I don't think anybody believes in this anymore. And I feel like in the universities and I mean, everybody to who I speak to, I mean, they all say that natural sciences cannot be taught apart from humanities and social sciences and vice versa, of course. And like we're here, I mean, we study in philosophy and I feel like this good old dualism thinking, this point of departure that you presented really stems from this old dualism that we really have to think anew, of course. And I feel like it's, yeah, I would just like to hear you about the political signification of this work that we do in philosophy, which is to rethink this dualism that, of course, we have inherited from early modernity. And just, just because I really would have thought that you would have said some things about the role of philosophy in thinking anew the, let's say, superstructural or ideological structure that allows for the domination of nature, for instance. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think you're right that this dualism between the natural and social sciences is part of the problem. I guess my own experience is maybe not so optimistic that everyone is past it, but I do think we need to get past it for sure. Yeah, and you're right that it is a distinctively modern way of thinking, right? So like someone like Aristotle, that kind of distinction wouldn't have really made sense to him, right? He thought about politics and he thought about biology, and the kind of division between natural and social sciences for him I think wasn't relevant or wouldn't have occurred to him even. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question. Okay.
I believe we had someone online. George, if you wanted to turn on your camera and unmute yourself and ask your question, please do.
Do you think that there is actually hope, or that like everything's like too bad already, or do you think that we need like some? But do you think that there is still hope that we can still like reverse this and avert like complete disaster, and like the temperature rises, everything becomes too hot, and like everything's not livable, or like people start to starve due to like failing crops or something, or like a whole bunch of natural disasters just like kill the planet?
Yeah, so I missed the first part of your question, but I think I got.
Is there still hope?
Yeah. Okay, is there still hope? Yeah. Okay, so the short answer is yes. But the somewhat longer answer, or slightly longer answer, is again to go back to this kind of metaphor of the ticking clock, right? So I think there's always still room for action, and there's always still room for change, and there's always the possibility of change. Whether we can go back to a pre-Anthropocene environment, I think no. But that's not to say that the only alternative to that is complete and utter catastrophe, right? Things can get better, things can get worse. Some Earth system changes are already locked in. So just thinking about climate change, for example. So we know that global temperatures have increased by a little bit more than 1 degree from pre-industrial levels. We know that there's more of that change that's kind of locked in based on carbon emissions that have already happened. But beyond that, we don't know what's going to happen, and even in a 1.5, 2, 3, 4 degree warmer world, there are still going to be people around, right? And there are still going to be better and worse forms of life. So I'm I would urge people to resist the kind of impulse to say, well, that's it, it's game over, or to say like once we get to whatever 450 parts per million or 2 degrees of global warming or whatever, like at that point, that's the deadline. I don't think that's a helpful or productive way to think about how to orient yourself towards the future.
So we're gonna get you a mic. Get a mic.
I know most of the media, social media, the media at large, and population at large has a tendency to this catastrophic thinking, Is there any way that we can have this kind of discussion, like more publicly, like, and have a different attitude in the public sphere? Like I'm like not from, but students, yes, discuss these matters and everything, but the Joe Blow down the street, he just, the world is ending, there's no way to solve this problem.
Yeah, that's a great question, how to have discussions about these issues that don't fall into that kind of catastrophizing. I mean, I think that kind of framing is really powerful in the kind of culture that we live in and the kind of cultural products that we consume, right? So we're all very familiar with the disaster movie trope, right? I mentioned Don't Look Up is one example of that kind of thing. There's lots of others where, what's the Bruce Willis one where they have to, like, there's an asteroid headed toward the planet and they have to, like, at the last moment, they knock it off course with an atomic bomb or something like that, right? It's a really powerful kind of framing. And, you think about all kinds of action and adventure movies, all kinds of pop cultural products, where that kind of story that we tell ourselves, right, of we're headed towards disaster, and just at the last minute, usually a muscly guy saves us from disaster, right? That's a story that we like to tell ourselves in our culture. And for times of ecological crisis, I think it's not a particularly helpful one because it's disempowering for those of us who are not Bruce Willis or Arnold Schwarzenegger or Leonardo DiCaprio, right? The answer to how we shift the kinds of discussions that we have away from that, it is not one that I have an easy answer to. But I think I want to suggest, at least, that it has something to do with the kinds of cultural forums that we have, right? So if we're all, I was going to say sitting in a movie theater, but that's an outdated kind of reference, right? Sitting at home, streaming the same kind of action movies. That's one kind of way for us to tell stories to each other. It relies on a few people telling a few kinds of stories to a lot of people. This kind of thinking or this kind of discussion forum, not just me sitting up here, but what will come in the second hour, is maybe more productive, right? Because it allows us to have discussions with each other. I think social media 10 years ago had that kind of promise. The internet 10 years before that also had that kind of promise as like a kind of democratizing technology. Something happened along the way with it, and I don't know if it's something that's inherent in the technology or if it's something that's inherent in the kind of ownership structure and the political economy of it, or the broader culture within which it's embedded. But yeah, I think we need more spaces for dialogue and conversation. We need to create those.
So my question was about I think the last three things, the 3 points you had at the end, I kind of summarize them into deliberative thinking, critical, reflective thinking, and one that's based on like praxis or practicality. And I was wondering to myself about where an affective or emotional way of thinking would fit into these three categories. And maybe I was like, practical, maybe it's a practical way of thinking. And that kind of, I think, follows the previous point that you were talking about, or the previous question about how do you approach, Joe Blow, your neighbor, the person who's, I guess, struggling with this existential question and problem. And what is the role of like faith and myth? Like you were mentioning the movie Don't Look Up and Apollo 13, and these like myths are surrounding eventual cataclysmic outcomes. It seems like there's a moratorium on how much climate research is being released. Like scientists have stopped releasing, or some of them have chosen to not sort of do more research just because all the research is there, like all of the reasoning, all of the evidence is out there already. It just seems to be a lack of belief or faith or trust in the science, and it seems to be something pointing towards like a mood which frames the whole discussion. So it's how does this emotive, mythological, affective way of thinking fit into the way we think about the crisis, and does that fit into that third point of like practical thinking that you mentioned at the end?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, you're absolutely right that emotional or affective thinking is absolutely crucial. When we think about what works to convince people, particularly when we're talking about environmental issues, there's been a lot of research on this, and just presenting people with more facts doesn't convince people who are not already primed to believe those facts. So what does work is establishing a kind of sense of commonality with people. So like people, researchers who work on how to convince climate deniers or people who are not unconcerned about these kinds of issues, is that research tells us that, again, just presenting people with kind of a litany of facts, or like, here's the disaster that's going to happen if we don't act by next week or next year or whatever, that kind of thing doesn't work. But what does work is creating a kind of connection, or starting from a kind of common point, right, that you have with the person that you're in dialogue with. I mean, I guess that is a kind of practical thinking, and it could fit into that third category. But maybe it deserves its own bullet point. Maybe I need 4 rather than 3 kinds of ways of thinking, because we're not merely rational creatures, and our thinking is not merely rational. It's emotional and affective. Whenever we communicate with people, we're not only engaged in a process of transmitting facts from one brain to another, right? This is, this thing about understanding other people's minds. It's not just about transmitting facts from one brain to another, or information from one brain to another. It's also about creating a connection with a person, right? Every act of communication is also an act of establishing or maintaining or degrading some kind of connection that we have with other people. And that's not purely rational, it's emotional, it's affective, and it comes from our nature as social beings, right? As beings who need each other and need to cultivate relationships with each other. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it seems to me that I'm not a philosopher or trained in philosophy, but it seems to me that part of the issue comes from what is real, what is nature reality, and how do people share their sense of what is real or not real. So what is a crisis to me, to a lot of my friends, is absolute nonsense. And I just wonder if you could comment on whether or how our political systems impact our perceptions of reality. And for instance, people on the right may believe or think differently than people on the left. And to what extent are our political systems even adequate to understand this kind of issue? And how, yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. I mean, mobilization is a whole different question. So.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another really good question. The project of transforming our environment depends on a shared understanding of what our environment is and how what's possible in terms of environmental transformation. We do. In other words, we do need to have a shared sense of reality if we're going to act collectively, all right, as a society. So to the extent that for example, political polarization creates a rift or a divorce in terms of different groups' understanding of reality, whether that's ecological reality or social reality, that's a real problem, right? The bigger the difference in terms of people's sense of reality, the harder it is for people to work together. And so that problem, there's lots of causes for it, from the nature of our political systems to social media ecosystems and echo chambers. Our media systems are part of it. And I think, again, to go sort of connect back to the previous question, what we need are political systems that allow us to have a dialogue, to deliberate collectively from a shared common understanding or a shared sort of starting point, right? And that maybe requires some work just to get to that shared understanding or shared starting point. But the political and media systems that we have, or at least the dominant ones, are not really set up for that purpose, right? Contemporary forms of social media in particular, they're not designed for facilitating deliberative dialogue. They're designed for attention getting and attracting eyeballs to advertisers and generating particular kinds of affective or emotional responses to get people to keep scrolling and so on. Yeah.
Hi. So you've kind of, if I'm understanding it correctly, made the argument that the primary task of philosophy in our current moment of ecological crisis is to facilitate a greater collective understanding of humanity in the world and our role in it. But it seems to me like the primary barriers towards action on the climate crisis are like political and cultural rather than scientific, and that political science and natural science both have have had roles to play in moving towards a solution to this crisis. I just kind of wanted to ask if you could go into more detail on what the role of philosophy is in a potential solution to these crises by which we're beset, and whether you think philosophy as a discipline actually has the power to cut through these political and cultural barriers that are impeding us?
Okay, great. Yeah, another really good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I think the primary barriers, if you want to think of it that way, are political and cultural. I think that's right. There are really important political and cultural barriers, and that some of the responses to the last couple of questions kind of suggest that as well. So the role of philosophy is to think about, to reflect on in this case, the political and cultural systems and concepts that we have that are part of the problem, right? And to the extent that we just accept those unproblematically, rather than reflecting on them critically, that's the problem, and that's where philosophy can come in, I guess. Does philosophy as a discipline have the power to save us? I think that was part of the question. Philosophy as a discipline, I would say no, but I think that philosophical thinking, does it have if it doesn't have the power to save us, it's at least an indispensable element to us dealing with our current problems adequately, right? That's I think a pretty safe way of saying it, right? Like, is more people getting philosophy degrees going to save us on its own? No, but yeah, philosophy can be valuable insofar as it informs political action, and philosophy can be valuable also insofar as it gets people to engage in critical and reflective thinking.
Hi, so I believe that is all the time we have for the question and answer period. So thank you so much again, Dr. Bureau. A round of applause for him again, please.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We are going to take a short 10-minute break, and then we will reconvene for the roundtable. So for those of you in the space, feel free to come back in about 10 minutes, grab some refreshments, grab a snack, and we'll be having discussion. Those of you on Zoom, please feel free to also stick around. For those of you who joined us on YouTube, we will be closing up the live stream. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you guys